Newly minted U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down with Megyn Kelly yesterday on her podcast in his first public interview, where he gave some extensive comments since he has been confirmed. And in this discussion here, he talked about quite a number of things about the U.S. foreign policy, what our philosophy is, and then specifically they looked at a number of places where his philosophy may be applied. And some things were good, some things were not so good, and some things are, well, frankly, troubling to me. And we're going to just, like we always do, look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that we know, you have the uncompromised truth, an intimidated truth about what's really going on here, so we have some idea of what we can expect going forward when we get into some of these more challenging foreign policy issues as we go throughout the Trump administration. So first of all, I want to look at what he said about kind of the concept with which he plans to approach the job as America's chief diplomat.
The United States needs to do what's in the best interest of the United States. Where our interests align, that's where you have partnerships and alliances. Where our differences are not aligned, that is where the job of diplomacy is to prevent conflict while still furthering our national interest and understanding they're going to further theirs. And that's been lost. And I think that was lost at the end of the Cold War because we were the only power in the world. And so we assumed this responsibility of sort of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. And there are terrible things happening in the world. There are. And then there are things that are terrible that impact our national interest directly. And we need to prioritize those again. So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was the product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent, Russia. And then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with. So now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be about furthering the national interest of the United States and doing so to the extent possible, avoiding war and armed conflict.
Okay, I'll just say right off the top, I absolutely love everything he just said, all of it. I think that it's long overdue. We just got out of the last administration, which, Joe Biden, his mantra was, we're the greatest military power in the history of the world. And basically we can do whatever we want to do. And it doesn't matter about what anybody else thinks. And that's just how it's going to be. And the implication for that was, there is still a unipolar world. It's still the United States and everybody else will do whatever we damn well tell them to do. Well, that's not the real world. That may be the one that they inhabited in their minds, but it was never going to be one. And there's so many people in the United States, especially, and in Western Europe also, that still are very afraid of any kind of multipolar world, and that means Russia, China, and, even others in other parts of, Europe, and then even in like India, Brazil, et cetera, other poles. And we needn't be afraid of that. We should never be. And I really liked what he said there about the fact that this is something that is normal. We should expect this. It was a unipolar world for a period of time after the end of the Cold War because the entire Soviet bloc literally collapsed and just disintegrated into a lot of chaos. And that was national security as well as economic, et cetera. But the expectation should always have been that was going to figure itself out. And at some point, everybody was going to recover from that, like happens throughout thousands of years of human history, and that the other poles were going to end up rising. That doesn't have to threaten us either economically or militarily, because our power is significant in both of those. And even if it's among many poles, we could still be one of the bigger poles, one of the bigger guys among the big guys, et cetera. And with wise foreign policy, with a good ability to work with others around the world, with our friends, with our adversaries, with our enemies even. I mean, there's effective ways that you can conduct yourself that's going to be good for the United States, which would ensure our national security indefinitely, which would ensure our economic vitality as far as the eye can see into the future. There's no reason why the arisal of other poles in the world should threaten any of that. It may make it more challenging, more complex, makes you have to do things differently. That's fine. There's no problem with that. As long as you have the flexibility of mind to be able to adjust and move in different directions and find ways. Again, if you're looking for win-win solutions, you're going to have a lot better chance of keeping everybody at bay, national security wise, so that nobody has any incentive to do anything to harm you, and economic wise, where they have positive incentive to want to work with you, because if they see they can benefit from it, most people in most nations are focused on their self-interest. And if you can exploit that to say, hey, your self-interest is going to be benefited by working with us, most people are going to do that. And when they don't, that's why you have a strong military. So if that was the case there, then that's going to be a good thing. And if that is our mentality, our focus forward, then that's going to be an improvement over the previous administration. Now, then the big question is going to be, how is that going to be applied? So Megan continued to talk to the Secretary of State and ask him a couple of specific areas, and we're going to talk about some of those and see how they line up with his comment at the beginning about what the mentality is and the going forward mentality that he's going to operate from. First, we're going to look at the Russia-Ukraine war, because that's kind of at the front right now. That's one of the things that helped get President Trump elected. That's one of the things that's been on the minds of a great many throughout the world, certainly in Europe and in Russia. So she asked him, and the way she characterized her first question, I thought was very good, very accurate and refreshing. She basically says, okay, so Ukraine has been lost, so what are we going to do next? And here's what Rubio said.
We just have to be realistic about the fact that Ukraine has lost. It's not going to gain back any of this ground, and we need a negotiated settlement now before we keep throwing good money after bad, and we can't afford it. We've got Americans who are suffering now. I think that's the majority view, even on the Republican side now.
It also happens to be the reality on the ground. First, let me say this. We think what Putin did was terrible. Invading a country, the atrocities he's committed, he did horrible things. But what the dishonesty that has existed is that we somehow led people to believe that Ukraine would be able not just to defeat Russia, but destroy them, push them all the way back to what the world looked like in 2012 or 2014, before the Russians took Crimea and the like. And in the result, what they've been asking for the last year and a half is to fund a stalemate, a protracted stalemate, in which human suffering continues. Meanwhile, Ukraine is being set back 100 years. Their energy grid is being wiped out. I mean, someone's going to have to pay for all this reconstruction after the fact.
So if you want to find out or want to assess, what are we going to do to get this solved? Certainly, we strongly concur with Megan's framing of this, that it's already past tense. The war is effectively lost, even though it's still being waged. The outcome is already known. And I thought it was fair for Rubio to say, all right, we're entering in right now. Here's the landscape that we were handed over by the previous administration. Now, just as a kind of an aside, I've always been opposed to virtually every administration that comes in, and they spend like half their time for the first, 3 to 4, or in some cases, in Obama's cases, like 8 or 6 of his 8 years, seem to always blame everything on the previous administration. Okay, look, you're the president now, you've got to deal with it. But it is definitely fair to, as you're entering office, to say, here's the landscape we have, and here's what was bequeathed to us by the outgoing administration. And he's right there. He said the previous administration led people to believe that we could drive Russia out of Ukraine. How many times did we see Biden talk about how Russia must lose and the Ukraine must prevail, and we're going to be behind them for as long as it takes, and Russia is going to lose and Ukraine is going to come into NATO? All of this kind of stuff that was never true. It was always aspirational. It was always in contradiction to the actual situation there on the ground. And of course, that has led everybody, from the West to continue to support something that was contrary to actual on the ground reality. And it just led people to believe things that were never going to be true. He also said that basically what we were doing was funding a stalemate. And there's a lot of truth to that charge as well. That we were the United States and by extension, the European Union, because they basically followed everything that we did. We were saying by saying the things that I just mentioned there about, we're going to drive Russia out. That Zelensky saying we're going to get back to our 1991 borders. All the support we gave during the 2023 offensive operation, especially. And then even after that failed, all through 2024, ignoring the situation on the ground, but continuing to say and continue to give funds, continue to add this weapon system, that capability, increasing this number of artillery shells, etc., should be knowing that it was never going to actually turn the tide and change the fundamentals on the war, because those were the Russian inputs you can't change. And we tried to do that with sanctions and other kinds of things, and we failed. And then we couldn't overcome that by providing enough ammunition, weapons, etc. And in fact, Time Magazine reported not long ago, a week or so ago, that actually Biden did that. He actually provided enough stuff to help them kind of stay afloat, but not enough that would risk actually having them win on the ground, because then he feared that could actually get us drawn into a bigger conflict. And of course, all that does is ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose, or at least postpone that day, ensure that they lose hundreds of thousands of people and produce nothing of any value for anybody on our side of the conflict. And so those were egregious violations of the outgoing administration. Now, Rubio has just said that he recognizes that he sees that was, those are bad things. So now the hope is, okay, now you're in charge. Now, what are you going to do? So then the next question that she asked him was, who is the bigger problem and the roadblock to find a negotiated settlement? Is it Putin or is it Zelensky?
Who's the bigger problem in reaching a final negotiated settlement there, right? Is it Putin or is it Zelensky? There's a report out that the Ukrainians are just banking on Putin digging his heels in and becoming annoying to President Trump on this, because he won't give an inch. And they're hoping that President Trump will come back over closer to their worldview about Putin, about Russia, about this conflict.
Well, I think there's the public and then there's the private, right? So in what you see portrayed publicly in conversations and what leaders say, a lot of it is speaking, they have domestic political considerations. Even Vladimir Putin, who controls media, still has to care about what public opinion is in Russia and his image and what, what his entire personality is built around.
Why do you think he does the shirtless pictures?
He didn't do those anymore. I think it's been a while,
I asked him, why do you do it? When I interviewed him, and he said, I give the people what they want.
Yeah, well, it's not going to end with the maximalist goals of either side. And there's going to have to be a lot of hard work done. And I think only the United States, under the leadership of President Trump, can make that possible.
Okay, fair enough. The only President Trump is going to be able to make something happen. And I agree with that, too. Be just like Joe Biden could have been the one that made something happen earlier and could have brought this to a close many, many times. And we've talked about it actually before the war started in Istanbul, a month and a half into it, in November 2022, and then, of course, in June of last summer. I mean, all kinds of opportunities, chose to ignore every one of them, just kept the war going on. So, fair enough. There are private conversations and public conversations. So it's okay. The U.S. side will say what it wants people to think domestically. Zelensky will say domestically. Putin will say things for his domestic audiences. Fair enough. But what's being said behind closed doors, and especially where is this going to end up leading to a conclusion here? Now, one of the first little orange flags or yellow flags that I have is the next thing that he said there was that, well, no one's going to get their maximalist opportunity. So it's not going to end. Zelensky's not going to get his 1991 borders back, and Putin's not going to get all he wants. So let's see if we can get Trump to come. Yeah, that's a problem. I don't know if he believes that, if he's been told that, or if he's just, again, making it for public consumption. I don't know, but let's hope that he doesn't actually believe that. Because there is absolutely the prospect that Russia can get its maximalist objectives. They have the capacity militarily, industrially, diplomatically, domestic politically from their side. Putin has everything he needs to actually take his maximalist objectives. If he can get them via negotiations, which many of the Russian officials have said, then they'll take that course of action. That's why Putin has continued to say, as recently as just a couple of days ago, that they're perfectly willing to talk to the United States, talk to the West, talk to Zelensky. He said he'll even talk to Zelensky. Won't sign a deal with Zelensky until he either becomes an elected official or they get some other personnel. That's a separate issue. But the fact is, he's willing to talk as long as his objectives are accomplished. So he can push for his maximalist objectives. And if he doesn't get those, he can simply just end the negotiation or just say, appreciate your opinion on this matter, but here's our capacity and this is where we're going. So that is so important for the chief diplomat of the United States to understand that the other side has the leverage, has the capacity to seek and obtain maximalist objectives, whereas the Ukraine side has no leverage and no ability to get almost any of its stated objectives. And Zelensky has been repeating those just even in the last few days, where he wants NATO membership for whatever's left of his country. He still doesn't even want to completely say, yes, we're going to sign over these territories. We'll sign them over, but with the understanding that we're going to get them back later, which, of course, is the last thing that Russia would ever do, because Russia went to war because of NATO that was going to come into Ukraine. There won't be any peacekeeping troops. The Russians have said that outright. So virtually none of the things that Zelensky says he wants, they have the leverage to have. And really, by extension, the United States is extremely limited on any leverage it has for Zelensky to get any of his things. Maybe he can squeeze out a couple of the minor things if possible. But folks, if you think that you're entering with some leverage to make things, some kind of 50-50 deal, then you're going to be sorely mistaken, and you're not going to be successful in your negotiations here. And he says, also that Trump is the one that can make it happen. And I think he's right there too. I think Trump is the one that can make it happen, as long as he understands that power dynamic, who has leverage and who doesn't. And listen, I just think that it's going to be in Trump's national interest, if, going back to Rubio's comment there about what the focus and the mentality is of foreign policy, which is to attain positive outcomes for the benefit of the United States, then it is in Trump's interest to say, I recognize the ground truth here. I see what's happening on the ground. You've got the ability to go forward with that. We don't have anything short of going to war against you, which we wouldn't do, because that would be the absolute worst thing for our national interest. So we're just going to make the best deal we can, which is going to be something like the 14 June line of last summer, which is going to be ugly for Ukraine side, but there's no way to avoid that now. Let's get it done. There's going to be so many people in the West that are going to be upset about it. Not everybody. Some people will say, good, finally get this off the table and move on to whatever's next. And there'll be a lot of squabble, and there'll be certainly all of the Democrat supporters of Joe Biden can be counted on to, act like shock and surprise. And I can't believe you handed over to Russia, blah, blah, blah. They'll say that. So you can just, enter into negotiations understanding that no matter how it turns out, he will for sure be blasted by his political opponents. That's just how it works. Okay, that's just part of the deal. That's how it works to be in the office of the president. So just take those hits, and then, like everything else, then you move on to your domestic agenda, and everybody will be focused on that. And 6 months or 12 months later, nobody's even going to remember this in the United States. That's just how it works. So Trump has the ability to do that. Let's hope that he chooses that path, as opposed to trying and thinking that, no, I can negotiate something better. Because, as Ambassador Freeman said on our show so accurately a week or so ago, you cannot win at the negotiating table what you cannot win on the battlefield. And Ukraine will never win on the battlefield anything that they haven't in the last 3 now full years. All right, moving on to the next topic here. That's in the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's look to the Middle East. First of all, we'll start off with Israel. Megan was asking Rubio, where are you on this whole ceasefire situation, and where's it going?
As long as there is an entity like Hamas, whose express purpose is the destruction of the Jewish state, who is willing to commit horrifying atrocities against civilians. So I think that the ceasefire is important, because it brought an end to some of the destruction and certainly allowed hostages to be freed at an extraordinary cost. I mean, we're talking about a ratio of 1 to, you get a teenage hostage in exchange for 250 killers. The real challenge here is going to be what happens when the ceasefire period expires. Who's going to govern Gaza? Who's going to rebuild Gaza? Mm-hmm. The good news in the region is, in Lebanon, we have a government that hopefully will become more powerful than Hezbollah in the Lebanese government, and there's a ceasefire that was extended there that ultimately will lead to that. In Syria, a group has taken over. These are not guys that would necessarily pass an FBI background check per se.
Would not be coming over for Sunday dinner.
But if there's an opportunity in Syria, if there is an opportunity in Syria to create a more stable place than what we've had historically, especially under Assad, where Iran and Russia dominated and where ISIS operated with impunity, we need to pursue that opportunity.
Okay, well, a lot to unpack there. Let's start off with what he said kind of at the first of it, was that Hamas, he said, first of all, you're dealing with Hamas, who is dedicated to the destruction of the Israeli state. Okay, verbally they are. There's no question. They've always said death to Israel and all this kind of stuff, just like Iran has said death to Israel and their chants for decades. No question about that. But then you have the issue of capacity, because Hamas has barely the enough capacity to exist. If it ever had any power to actually challenge Israel's ability to exist, it would have done it long, long time ago. And the fact that since its inception, since it was created, and I think when it first won power in 2007, up until the current day, the only thing they could do, the best they ever did, was the October 3rd terrorist attack, where they killed about 1,000 innocent Israeli civilians, and then about 200 Israeli soldiers were also killed in that attack. So that was an egregious blow to Israel. It was horrible. It was emotionally stressful for the entire nation. Also, obviously, caused them to turn into the attack onto the Gaza Strip, etc. There is no chance in no matter whatever happens ever, that Hamas could actually put the threat the Israeli country. Zero chance, period. Israel has nuclear weapons. Nobody in the Middle East is going to threaten their existence, because the Israelis have the capacity and clearly the demonstrated will to use a lot of their power if they ever feel threatened. So no one is going to threaten the Israeli existence without any help from us because of their own domestic capacity. That's why we've been providing, upwards of $3 billion and more per year, even before all of this war here started, so that they could defend themselves. And they have done a very, very admirable job. And they have a defense capacity that nobody, no state in the region, to include Israel, could challenge. They can cause them some problems and some difficulties around the edges, which has been happening for a long time, but nobody can challenge the Israeli state's existence, because Israel is more powerful on every front than everybody else in the region. So that's understandable, first of all. So that when you're talking about what your policies are going to be, you got to be dealing with the facts and the realities on the ground. Israel is the most powerful entity in the Middle East. So let's start with the understanding of that. Then he talks about how Hamas has been weakened severely, but they haven't been destroyed. Netanyahu set out as an objective, a political objective for his military force as they went into Gaza, even before the end of October 2023, that they wanted to destroy Hamas, that he wanted a total and complete military victory. And I've been saying since that day forward, all the way through, and we'll repeat again here, there is no military solution for Israel's problem here. They cannot kill their way out of it. The only possibility would be is if they literally turned genocidal and massacred 2 million people, and then it would probably have to be 5 million when you factor in the West Bank, because they would certainly never be passive on that, or you physically get them out of the territory. Trump has floated that idea, which got immediate condemnation, not just in the Middle East from our friendly Arab regimes, but also from others around the world, because no one's going to contemplate that. So I think that was a trial balloon that was floated by President Trump. I don't see any prospect that anybody could get by with doing that, because it would be resisted by so many. I mean, Egypt and Jordan themselves, the two specific nations he suggested, are adamantly opposed to it, because it would potentially destabilize their own countries. And then in their view, it would make them complicit in ethnic cleansing with Israel. And I don't think either government would ever survive their people, because there are literally millions of Palestinians and other sympathetic Arabs that live in their countries naturally, that would be violently opposed to them participating in that and basically helping out Israel ethnically cleanse Arabs out of an area. None of one's going to sit. So whatever's been asked, the practical limitations of that are just too high. So that's probably not going to happen. Well, then that now leaves you then back again with the thorny reality. Then, if you have this intractable problem and you're not going to kill your way out of it, and you're not going to ethnically cleanse the area, then you have to go back to diplomacy. And that is, again, if we're doing something that's in America's national interest, then we're going to have to say, all right, Israel, you guys are going to have to figure something out, how to live together. You're not going to kill them all, and you're not going to get them out. So the only alternative left then is that you have to find a way to live together. That's just the only way there is. If Israel thinks it's going to go back to the status quo ante, meaning like on October the 10th or October the 6th, rather, before all the terrorist strike happened in 23, that's not going to work either. The reason why October 7th happened was because of everything that had happened prior to that. And the pressure had been building, because basically they were being imprisoned in the Gaza Strip with no freedoms, no rights or anything else. And they had been, they were being militarily oppressed by the Israeli side. Those are just the facts. Those are not opinions. That's not a commentary on who's right or wrong. That's the recitation of what actually was going on the ground, and that caused the Palestinian people to reach that explosive point that finally reached on October the 7th. That will be replicated in the future if there's no diplomacy, if there's no negotiated settlement that has any prospect of having the Palestinian people have reason to think they have a hope and a future. I just that's another of my common themes, but it must be repeated here because it is of vital interest for the Israeli people, for the civilians, for their government, and for American interest in the region. You've got to find some way to live together. Otherwise, you're going to have perpetual violence in the region, and nobody's going to have security. Nobody. One of the other things he said that same there was he said, Lebanon is now stronger, and now then there's a chance for peace in Lebanon because they've been made superior over Hezbollah because of the military harm that Israel did to the Hezbollah side over this war. That's also untrue. There has been no question severe harm done to the Hezbollah organization, both at the top and at the fighter level, without question. A whole bunch of damage. Almost the whole leadership was wiped out, and the whole leadership has been replaced. It always happens this way. No one should be surprised by this. Just because Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated and most of his top generals were assassinated, et cetera, and the whole pager, radio bombing thing that went on and killed a bunch of other people in the hierarchy, they've all been replaced, or else they've been recovered in some cases and come back in. But the conditions that led to the rise of Hezbollah still exist. So even if you've killed those guys, there's just going to be a new crop come back up in. And they're smarting, they're hurting from the military damage that was done. They're in a semi ceasefire right now, not only semi because it's periodically broken. And so, but that's also not going to change. If Israel doesn't do anything different in its behavior towards Lebanon, then the Lebanese military is not going to be strong enough to overcome Hezbollah like they weren't in the decades prior to this. People need to be clear on that. He also said, Syria is more stable now. Now we can have more peace in the Middle East. That's a fantasy. You're just dreaming there. We have no idea what Syria is going to be like. What we do know is that there's still the Syrian Democratic Forces, the primarily Kurdish people in an enclave and part of it. You have Turkish forces part of that. You have other rebel kind of groups. You have some that are allied with Turkey in different parts of Syria. You have the HTS who now kicked out Assad, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to form. It's way too early to know if they're going to be able to maintain their internal unity of all these different groups that work together with the HTS to drive out Assad. I have my doubts. I have serious doubts. Historically speaking, that all these groups are going to suddenly just put all their differences aside and work together, and the thing's going to work out good for the Syrian people. I hope that's the case. I certainly do, but you're just rolling the dice to put any kind of hopes on that working out. So it's a way too early to be calling that a situation. So bottom line is right now it's just as chaotic as it's been in a long time, and if nothing is done differently with the United States and Israel on all of those fronts, then all of the historic chaos and violence that has preceded, just going back decades, not just even to the first Trump administration, you're not going to have any better outcome than you did before. And one of the other things, in fact, there's one more little clip I want to show here where he talks about other parts of the Middle East. Let me bring you up to that on the backside of that one.
You have a region in which you have a more stable Syria, a more stable Lebanon where Hezbollah is not able to do the things it does on behalf of Iran, a weakened Iran, who's now lost all of these proxies. It now opens the door to things like a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would change the dynamic of the region. And then ultimately, not make easy, but make easier resolving some of these challenges that we face with the Palestinian question, and in particular with the Gaza question.
Yeah, that's again wishful thinking there. Now, he is right that Iran has been significantly weakened from what it was prior, because it's proxies and the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas have all been militarily degraded but not destroyed. So they're weakened from what they were relative to the beginning of prior to 10/7, but still present. So they still have to be dealt with. But Iran is at the moment weaker. Also, they've had some of their own internal stuff taken out by Israeli airstrikes in some of the two exchanges that they had in 2024. But if you're hoping that now then you can take the advantage of this opportunity and say, let's get back to it. When he says with Saudi Arabia, he's talking about the Abraham Accords. That was one of the signature achievements of the Trump administration in the first term, to where they got Israel to make peace with some of its neighbors. And they were really wanting to get the crown jewel, which was Saudi Arabia. And they were working on that. Even the Biden administration was working towards that outcome when 10/7 happened and threw everything into turmoil. Saudi Arabia has continued to say it desires to have peaceful coexistence with Israel. The Arab League emphatically, well, I think we showed several months back how their leader was emphatically saying that they absolutely desire to have peaceful relations with Israel. The whole region does. Ergo, there is substance there that says that peaceful relations can be occurred as long as, and this is Saudi Arabia as well as the other Arab regimes, there has to be movement towards a Palestinian state. They are saying what I've been trying to preach to anyone who would listen. If you don't have a path to peace and a future and a hope for the Palestinian people, nobody is going to get peace. So if you want a deal, there is a deal to be had there, but only if we change the way we've been doing business. And if Secretary Rubio is true to his word that American foreign policy is based on what's going to be good for American interests, then we need to just tell Israel, you're going to have to do something different if you want our continued substantial support going forward, because it is not in America's interest to continue giving billions of dollars every year to Israel at the expense of the absence of peace in the rest of the Middle East. It's just not. So we'll see if President Trump will push against the extraordinary pressure that comes certainly from the Israeli side, both domestically and internationally, because they don't want the president to give on anything. They want all the money to continue to flow. They want complete diplomatic coverage. They want political support, and they want no compulsions to do anything that they don't want to do, i.e., they don't want any requirements to give a single thing on the Palestinian issue at all. That's just how it is. That's how it has been. And it remains to be seen whether that's how it will be. If it is, then America's interest in the Middle East will not be improved. It will remain chaotic, and Israel's security will not be improved. It will stay at a threat level no matter whether it wants. That's just how it is. All right, moving on to the different topic here. Now we have a bit of a thorny issue here with Greenland, China, and the United States.
It is completely realistic to believe that the Chinese will eventually, maybe even in the short term, try to do in Greenland what they have done at the Panama Canal and in other places, and that is install facilities that give them access to the Arctic with the cover of a Chinese company, but that in reality serve a dual purpose, that in a moment of conflict, they could send naval vessels to that facility and operate from there. And that is completely unacceptable to the national security of the world and to the security of the world and the national security of the United States. So the question becomes, if the Chinese begin to threaten Greenland, do we really trust that that is not a place where those deals are going to be made? Do we really trust that that is not a place where they would not intervene? Maybe
you don't
by
think
force?
Denmark would stop them?
I think that's been the president's point, and that is that Denmark can't stop them. They would rely on the United States to do so. And so his point is, if the United States is on the hook to provide, as we are now, we have a defense agreement with them to protect Greenland if it comes under assault. If we're already on the hook for having to do that, then we might as well have more control over what happens there. He wants to pay for it. And how we worked on something like that, how something like that is approached, obviously is probably done better in the appropriate forums. A lot of the stuff is done publicly, and it's not helpful because it puts the other side in a tough spot domestically. So those conversations are going to happen, but this is not a joke. Like what he is saying is pretty accurate. People don't talk about it for years. This is not about acquiring land for the purpose of acquiring land. This is in our national interest, and it needs to be solved.
Okay, a lot to unpack there too. Let's start off with his presumption and his baseline that Greenland is important because China could do the same thing there that it did in the Panama Canal, which is another issue that Trump has raised since being elected. Well, let's take a look first of all at the Panama Canal issue. have the Chinese taken over the Panama Canal? The answer is unequivocally no. There is no change to the Panama Canal since I think it was 1997. There is a Hong Kong entity, company, that is operating the Panama Canal locks, some of them, by authority of the Panamanian government. Much like any companies from other places are operating different issues along with the Panama Canal. It's not just that one company, but they do run the locks on both sides of the canal. They have been there since 1997. There has never been an issue with that. No one has ever threatened anybody. The Chinese have never sought to stop anyone. They don't have separate tariffs and fees and whatnot for American vessels as opposed to any other. They don't get special treatment anywhere else. They simply operate it under the constraints of the Panamanian government. So there is no issue that the Chinese are controlling the Panama Canal. The Panamanian government controls it. And these Hong Kong company that operates these locks are a company. They're not a military organization, i.e., they don't have any firepower, etc. If China ever moved on the Panama Canal militarily, treaty or no treaty, the United States is certainly not going to sit by and be passive. We don't need to, quote, own the Panama Canal if we desire to keep it open militarily should China ever move into it. But China's not going to do that, because whereas China is very, very strong in the South China Sea area, in the Taiwan Straits area, where they have their so-called A2 AT defensive situation, and out to the second and third island chain, all that kind of stuff. In their backyard, they are very, very strong and powerful. And if we ever attempt to take on China and to fight China over Taiwan, for example, they have all the advantages, and we would be in a world of hurt. Anywhere rest of the world, however, if China tries to do something in Panama, they will be immediately crushed, because our capacity globally to send out power, our naval capacity, our air capacity, our ability to project power anywhere around the world is unrivaled, and China can't even come close to matching it. Meaning, if they ever did, they don't have the capacity to project power effectively that far. Yes, they can send a handful of vessels, but they can't support them. They can't sail them all the long distance, because we have assets and naval bases everywhere that could interdict them, that could take them out if they ever did, and therefore they won't do it. So there is no genuine Chinese threat against the Panama Canal. That's just not accurate, and it's not truthful based on the realities on the ground. So if that be the case for that one, what is the case then for Greenland? So Rubio's saying, if the Chinese decided to take out Greenland, then what would we do? Because he said we already have, as he said correctly, we already have a defense agreement with Denmark to defend Greenland in the event that anything happens. So then you would have to ask the right question. Well, then why do we need to do something different, since that's already existing? Well, let's just take a look at a map real quick, and let's try to take a look at what we're looking at here. All right, so here's the United States. You may be familiar with that. Here is Greenland, of course. This is Canada right here. And let's see, China. So this is Russia right here. China is way down here. So you're going to have to make a case for me that China is going to send some of its naval assets around Russia, going to go through here, the Bering Sea, get into the Arctic Ocean, and then come over here, and then what? You're going to invade Greenland? I mean, come on, man. I mean, just take a look at that. You just see how laughable that is. China doesn't have the capacity to do that. They would have to be so exposed. And the majority of our naval, I mean, we have substantial naval power on the West Coast. We've got it on the East Coast. We've got some in Europe, etc. I mean, we would absolutely just pummel them. They would never have a chance to get anywhere near that. And yet he wants to sit there and say with a straight face, yes, that, if China ever, came after Greenland, what would we do? Well, the same thing we would do now. We already have military bases on Greenland. We don't need any additional ones, because we've got so much military power in the region anyway. And of course, we've got our ally Canada there. I don't know if you remember them. To our northern border there, we have military agreements here. They're part of NATO. So if anything ever happened, Denmark is part of that same security arrangements. So there's really no reason to do anything different there. Well, what is really different then? What is kind of driving a lot of this? Well, in this area here, if you can see my cursor on the map there, just I think since 2010, so it's relatively recent, there has been the discovery that there are likely, I want to say the number is 52 billion barrels of oil underneath this sea right here, and this waterway in here. There's some deposits here, a number of them in this area here. They have been largely untapped so far, and there are hundreds of probably billions of dollars of rare earth materials also in Greenland underneath the ice caps, and apparently there's underneath the surface there, and only recently has it been something available for extraction. Greenland is estimated to be the 8th largest supplier or natural resources of rare earth materials on the planet, which makes it pretty important. So when you look and you see lots of oil deposits, and I think even bigger gas deposits, natural gas deposits, and the rare earths, you see that it is an extraordinary lucrative situation. Well, right now, it's basically owned by Denmark and operated by the people on Greenland and independently so. And for anyone to mine any of these things or to extract these minerals, they have to just do business. They just have to be able to make deals with the government that's involved there, and then do business by whatever terms. One may wonder if the United States says, "Hey, if we own Greenland, and if we make them a 51st state or anything like that, then all of a sudden we don't have to ask anybody else for permission. We can just go in and start mining those things." One has to wonder, to what extent is that motivating the United States here? Because if they're saying that there's a national security imperative, it's not. I don't care what anybody says. There is no national security imperative that would be solved by us owning Greenland that we don't already have the capacity, because it won't add one Navy ship. It won't add one rocket. It won't add anything to our national security that doesn't exist today. Zero. So there is no national security threat. China doesn't even have the capacity to put it under any kind of military threat, but there is a pretty big economic situation there. And even that is not necessary. You don't need to own Greenland to do it. Those materials are there, and with just basic diplomacy, a lot of those things can be worked out, because it's a good business for, I don't understand really how Denmark would or wouldn't benefit financially, but certainly the people on Greenland would, if they want to do that. And of course, I think I've heard a lot of people up there say that they don't want a lot of these reserves to be drilled because they don't want the environmental damage that could come or whatever. So that means we could be limited. But that's just how it works. I think it's a slippery slope and a dangerous path to be going to say, well, there's economic potential there to be exploited, and we'll either get it from a deal or we'll get it through force, is a bad thing for the United States. That's not what we're supposed to be based on. That's not the kind of people we have historically been. Okay, I hear some of you laughing about that. We definitely have some dark periods in our past where we have done that. That's not what we're supposed to do, and not what we should do now. And so I'm opposed to that. We have plenty of natural resources of our own. We have plenty of oil and natural gas in our own backyard. It's something that could likely last many, many decades into the future. We don't need to go after this. There is also oil and gas is a global commodity. It's mined all over the place, and the price is also a globally set, and it affects everybody. But so far, we've been able to meet that. There is no reason and no either financial or national security threat to the United States that we need to go after Greenland. And I think that we should back off on doing that. Let's see, one of the other things I wanted to point out was that, he talks about this like it's a problem to be solved. And folks, it just isn't. It's not a problem to be solved. We haven't suffered because we didn't own Greenland for, since Trump first came into office, or since there was a Greenland, since there was an America. We've never suffered. So there's no problem that exists now that didn't exist a year ago, 5 years ago, 50 years ago. There's nothing there. It's an opportunity, but it's not something that requires compulsion of somebody else to give us something, or that we'll take it by force. We don't need to do that. And I certainly hope that this is just posturing, and some way to negotiate something that if some kind of a deal can be struck with Denmark and or Greenland that can benefit everybody, then as long as it's done legally, then that's fine, that we can get that done. But we need to be very careful that we don't go beyond that and to start compelling people to do what we want and taking it if they don't, because that sets us up in a very dangerous place and will, I think, eventually take from us national security. It won't add to it. And that's something that I think is important to point out. We got to be honest about this. The Trump administration's come in. They're doing a lot of good things. Rubio has talked a good game about what the new philosophy should be. And if he applies that can benefit the United States. But just like we did with the Biden administration here at the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, we're going to hold everybody's feet to the fire. We're going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, no matter who's in the White House. That's what we do here because we want you to be armed with the truth. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to remind you again that we are on podcast now. Some of you may not have time to watch us on video all the time, and some of your friends may just like to get their news and podcasts. Be sure to share that with them. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get that, we're there to be found, and a lot of people would probably appreciate you pointing that out there to us. Thank you very much, and we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.